Today we will continue our reading in a series of unfortunate events. The the bad beginning. Actually, that's a good intro. Written by Lemony Snicket. And this is the first book in a 13 book series. And as the name implies, it is a series of unfortunate events. Good things never happen to these kids. It's always something bad happening. And we start with the first baddie of the series. That would be... One second, please.
Count Olaf?
Count Olaf, thank you, honey. Count Olaf. The kid's so-called uncle. Excuse me. So, we are going to be going through this. We'll read as far as we can for about an hour and see where we are at. So, without further ado, let us continue our reading in a series of unfortunate events. The Bad Beginning. Don't mind the Muppet Show Tonight is playing in the background. Okay. The Baudelaire orphans copied the puttanesca recipe from the cookbook onto a piece of scrap paper, and Justice Strauss was kind enough to escort them to the market to buy the necessary ingredients. Count Olaf had not left them very much money, but the children were able to buy everything they needed from a street vendor. They purchased olives after tasting several varieties and choosing their favorites. At a pasta store, they selected interestingly shaped noodles and asked the woman running the store the proper amount for 13 people. The 10 people Count Olaf mentioned, and the three of them. Then, at the supermarket, they purchased garlic, which is a sharp-tasting bulbous plant, anchovies, which are small salty fish, capers, which are flower buds of a small shrub and taste marvelous, and tomatoes, which are actually fruits and not vegetables, as most people believe. They thought it would be proper to serve dessert, and bought several envelopes of pudding mix. Perhaps the orphans thought if they made a delicious meal, Count Olaf might be a bit kinder to them. Thank you so much for helping us out today, Violet said, as she and her siblings walked home with Justice Strauss. I don't know what we would have done without you. You seem like very intelligent people, Justice Strauss said. I dare say you would have thought of something. But it continues to strike me as odd that Count Olaf has asked you to prepare such an enormous meal. Well, here we are. I must go inside and put my own groceries away. I hope you children will come over soon and borrow books from my library. Tomorrow? Claus said quickly. Could we come over tomorrow? I don't see why not, Justice Strauss said, smiling. I can't tell you how much we appreciate this, Violet said carefully. With their kind parents dead and Count Olaf treating them so abominably. The three children were not used to kindness from adults, and weren't sure if they were expected to do anything back. Tomorrow, before we use your library again, Klaus and I would be more than happy to do household chores for you. Sunny isn't really old enough to work, but I'm sure we could find some way she could help you. Justice Strauss smiled at the three children, but her eyes were sad. She reached out a hand and put it on Violet's hair, and Violet felt more comforted than she had in some time. That won't be necessary, Justice Strauss said. You are always welcome in my home. Then she turned and went into her home, and after a moment of staring after her, the Baudelaire orphans went into theirs. For most of the afternoon, Violet, Claus, and Sunny cooked the puttanesca sauce according to the recipe. Violet roasted the garlic and washed washed and chopped the anchovies. Claus peeled the tomatoes and pitted the olives. Sunny banged on a pot with a wooden spoon, singing a rather repetitive song she had written herself. And all three of the children felt less miserable than they had since their arrival at Count Olaf's. The smell of cooking food is often a calming one, and the kitchen grew cozy as the sauce simmered, a culinary term which means cooked over low heat. The three orphans spoke of pleasant memories of their parents and about Justice Strauss, who they agreed was a wonderful neighbor and in whose library they planned to spend a great deal of time. As they talked, they mixed and tasted the chocolate pudding. Just as they were placing the pudding in the refrigerator to cool, Violet, Claus, and Sunny heard a loud, booming sound as the front door was flung open. And I'm sure I don't have to tell you who was at home. Who was home? Orphans? Count Olaf called out in his scratchy voice. Where are you, orphans? In the kitchen, Count Olaf, Claus called. We're just finishing dinner. You'd better be, Count Olaf said, and strode into the kitchen. He gazed at all three Baudelaire children with his shiny, shiny eyes. My troop is right behind me, and they are very hungry. Where is the roast beef? We didn't make roast beef, Violet said. We made puttanesca sauce. What? Count Olaf asked. No roast beef? You didn't tell us what you wanted roast beef, Claus said. Count Olaf slid toward the children so that he looked even taller than he was. His eyes grew even brighter, and his one eyebrow raised in anger. In agreeing to adopt you, he said, I have become your father, and as your father, I am not someone to be trifled with. I demand that you serve roast beef to myself and my guests. We don't have any, Violet cried. We made puttanesca sauce. No, 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 Sunny shouted. Count Olaf looked down at Sunny, who had spoken so suddenly. With an inhuman roar, he picked her up in one scraggly hand and raised her so she was staring at him in the eye. Needless to say, Sunny was very frightened and began crying immediately, too scared to even try to bite the hand that held her. Put her down immediately, you beast! Claus shouted. He jumped up, trying to rescue Sunny from the grasp of the Count. But he was holding her too high to reach. Count Olaf looked down at Claus and smiled a terrible, toothy grin, raising the wailing Sunny up even higher in the air. He seemed about to drop her to the floor when there was a large burst of laughter in the next room. Olaf! Where's Olaf? Voices called out. Count Olaf paused, still holding the wailing Sunny up in the air, as members of his theater troupe walked into the kitchen. Soon they were crowding the room, an assortment of strange-looking characters of all shapes and sizes. There was a bald man with a very long nose, dressed in a long black robe. There were two women had who had bright white powder all over their faces, making them look like ghosts. Behind the women was a man with very long and skinny arms, at the end of which were two hooks instead of hands. There was a person who was extremely fat and who looked like neither a man nor a woman. And behind this person, standing in the doorway, there were an assortment of people the children could not see, but who promised to be just as frightening. Here you are, Olaf, said one of the white-faced women. What in the world are you doing? I'm just disciplining these orphans, Count Olaf said. I asked them to make dinner, and all they have made is some disgusting sauce. You can't go easy on children, the man with the hook hand said. They must be taught to obey their elders. The tall, bald man peered at the youngsters. Are these, he said to Count Olaf, those wealthy children you were telling me about? Yes, Count Olaf said. They are so awful, I can scarcely stand to touch them. With that, he lowered Sunny, who was still wailing, to the floor. Violet and Claus breathed a sigh of relief that he had not dropped her from that great height. I don't blame you, said someone in the doorway. Count Olaf rubbed his hands together as if he had been holding something revolting instead of an infant. Well, enough talk, he said. I suppose we will eat their dinner, even though it is all wrong. Everyone, follow me to the dining room, and I will pour us some wine. Perhaps by the time these brats serve us, we will be too drunk to care if it is roast beef or not. Hurrah! Cried several members of the troop, and they marched through the kitchen, following Count Olaf into the dining room. Nobody paid a bit of attention to the children, except for the bald man, who stopped and stared Violet in the eye. You're a pretty one, he said, taking her face in his rough hands. If I were you, I would try not to anger Count Olaf, or I might wreck that pretty little face of yours. Forgot about that. Anywho, sorry. Yours. Violet shuddered, and the bald man gave a high-pitched giggle and left the room. The Baudelaire children, alone in the kitchen, found themselves breathing heavily, as if they had just run a long distance. Sonny continued to wail, and Claus found that his eyes were wet with tears as well. Only Violet didn't cry, but merely trembled with fear and revulsion, a word which here means an unpleasant mixture of horror and disgust. For several moments, none of them could speak. This is terrible, terrible, Claus said finally. Violet, what can we do? I don't know, she said. I'm afraid. Me too, Claus said. Hooks, Sunny said as she stopped crying. Let's have some dinner, someone shouted from the dining room, and the theater troupe began pounding on the table in strict rhythm, which is an exceedingly rude thing to do. We better serve the puttanesca, Claus said, or who knows what Count Olaf will do to us. Violet thought of what the bald man had said about wrecking her face and nodded. The two of them looked at the pot bubbling sauce, which had seemed so cozy while they were making it, and now looked like a vat of blood. Then, leaving Sunny behind in the kitchen, then leaving Sunny behind in the kitchen, they walked into the dining room. Claus carrying a bowl of the interestingly shaped noodles, and Violet carrying the pot of puttanesca sauce and a large ladle with which to serve it. The theater troupe was walking and cackling, drinking again and again from their wine cups and paying no attention to the Baudelaire orphans as they circled the tables serving everyone dinner. Violet's right hand ached from holding the heavy ladle. She thought of switching to her left hand, but because she was right-handed, she was afraid she might spill the sauce with her left hand, which could enrage Count Olaf again. She stared miserably at Olaf's plate of food and found herself wishing she had bought poison at the market and put it in the puttanesca sauce. Finally, they were through serving, and Claus and Violet slipped back into the kitchen. They listened to the wild, rough laughter of Count Olaf and his theater troupe, and they picked at their own portions of food. Too miserable to eat, before long, Olaf's friends were pounding on the table in strict rhythm again, and the orphans went out to the dining room to clear the table, and then again to serve the chocolate pudding. By now, it was obvious that Count Olaf and his associates had drunk a great deal of wine, and they slouched at the table and spoke much less. Finally, they roused themselves and trooped back through the kitchen, scarcely, scarcely glancing at the children on their way out of the house. Count Olaf looked around the room, which was filled with dirty dishes. Because you haven't cleaned up yet, he said to the orphans, I suppose you can be excused from attending tonight's performance. But after cleaning up, you are to go straight to your beds. Claus had been glaring at the floor, trying to hide how upset he was. But at this, he could not remain silent. You mean our bed? He shouted. You have only provided us with one bed. Members of the theater troupe stopped in their tracks at this outburst and glanced from Claus to Count Olaf to see what would happen next. Count Olaf raised his one eyebrow, and his eyes shone bright. but he spoke calmly. If you would like another bed, he said, tomorrow you may go into town and purchase one. You know perfectly well we haven't any money, Claus said. Of course you do, Count Olaf said, and his voice began to get a little louder. You are the inheritors of an enormous fortune. That money, Claus said, remembering what Mr. Poe said, is not to be used until Violet is of age. Count Olaf's face grew very red. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, in one sudden movement, he reached down and struck Claus across the face. Claus fell to the floor, his face inches from the eye tattooed on Olaf's ankle. His glasses leaped from his face and skittered into a corner. His left cheek, where Olaf had struck him, felt as if it were on fire. The theater troupe laughed, and a few of them applauded as if Count Olaf had done something very brave instead of something despicable. Come on, friends, Count Olaf said to his comrades. We'll be late for our own performance. If I know you, Olaf, said the man with the hooked hands, you'll figure out a way to get at the Baudelaire money. We'll see, Count Olaf said, but his eyes were shining bright as if he already had an idea. There was another loud boom as the front door shut behind Count Olaf and his terrible friends, and the Baudelaire children were alone in the kitchen. Violet knelt at Claus's side, giving him a hug to try to make him feel better. Sydney crawled over to his glasses, picked them up, and brought them to him. Claus began to sob, not so much from the pain, but from the rage at the terrible situation they were in. Violet and Sunny cried with him, and they continued weeping as they washed the dishes, and as they blew out the candles in the dining room, and as they changed out of their clothes and lay down to go to sleep. Claus in the bed, Violet on the floor, Sunny on her little cushion of curtains. The moonlight shone through the window, and if anyone had looked into the Baudelaire orphan's bedroom, they would have seen three children crying quietly all night long. And that is the end of chapter 4. Let me quickly look at... Oh. I guess there's no messaging I can check on here, huh? Is there?
You're looking for the time?
No, not the time. I was just checking to see if I could look at the... Yeah, I'm not seeing the message that it usually has up here. But that's okay. So yeah, I hope you all are enjoying this book. Yeah, we finished reading chapter 4, and it is under 20 minutes as of right now. We're almost at the 20-minute mark. So it's pretty good. It's not a very lengthy book, as you can see. But yeah, it's gonna be interesting time to see how many parts we can get with this book. But yeah, again, we've got the Muppets Tonight being played in the background. Garth Brooks is the guest. I remember watching this recorded when I was a kid, but this one...
Going down the rabbit trail, are we, babe?
Yeah. But anywho, I hope you all are enjoying this book. We'll go ahead and continue reading the next chapter, chapter 5. The last one we read was chapter 4. So this right here, right now, is chapter 5 of a series of unfortunate events, The Bad Beginning. Unless you have been very, very lucky, you have undoubtedly experienced events in your life that have made you cry. So unless you have been very, very lucky, you know that a good, long session of weeping can often make you feel better, even if your circumstances have not changed one bit. So it was with the Baudelaire orphans. Having cried all night, they rose the next morning, feeling as if a weight were off their shoulders. The three children knew, of course, that they were still in a terrible situation. but they thought they might do something to make it better. The morning's note from Count Olaf ordered them to chop firewood in the backyard, and as Violet and Claus swung the axe over each other, over each log to break it into smaller pieces, they discussed possible plans of action, while Sunny chewed meditatively on a small piece of wood. Clearly, Claus said, fingering the ugly bruise on his face where Olaf had struck him, we cannot stay here any longer. I'd rather take my chances on the streets than live in this terrible place. But who knows what misfortune? But who knows what misfortunes would befall us in the streets? Violet pointed out. At least here we have a roof over our heads. I wish our parents' money could be used now instead of when you come of age. Claus said. Then we could buy a castle and live in it, with armed guards patrolling the outside to keep out Count Olaf and his troop. And I could have a large inventing studio, Violet said wistfully. She swung the axe down and split a log neatly in two, filled with gears and pulleys and wires in an elaborate computer system. And I could have a large library, Claus said, as comfortable as Justice Strauss's, but more enormous. Gibbo! Sonny shrieked, which appeared to mean, and I could have lots of things to bite. But in the meantime, Violet said, we have to do something about our predicament. Perhaps Justice Strauss could adopt us, Claus said. She said we were always welcome in her home. But she meant for a visit, or to use her library, Violet pointed out. She didn't mean to live. Perhaps if we explained our situation to her, she would agree to adopt us, Claus said hopefully. But when Violet looked at him, she saw that he knew it was of no use. Excuse me. Adoption is an enormous decision, and not likely to happen impulsively. I'm sure you, in your life, have occasionally wished to be raised by different people than the ones who are raising you, but knew in your heart that the chances of this were very slim. I think we should. I think we should go see Mr. Poe, Violet said. He told us when he dropped us here that we could contact him at the bank if we had any questions. We don't really have a question, Claus said. We have a complaint. He was thinking of Mr. Poe walking toward them at Briny Beach with his terrible message. Even though the fire was, of course, not Mr. Poe's fault, Claus was reluctant to see Mr. Poe because he was afraid of getting more bad news. I can't think of anyone else in contact, Violet said. And Mr. Poe is in charge of our affairs, and I'm sure if he knew how horrid Count Olaf is, he would take us right out of here. Claus pictured Mr. Poe arriving in his car and putting the Baudelaire orphans inside, to go somewhere else, and felt a stirring of hope. Anywhere would be better than here. Okay, he said. Let's get this firewood all chopped, and we'll go to the bank. Invigorated by their plan, the Baudelaire orphans swung their axes at an amazing speed, and soon enough they were done chopping firewood and ready to go to the bank. They remembered Count Olaf saying he had a map of the city, and they looked thoroughly for it, but they couldn't find any trace of a map, and decided it must be in the tower, where they were forbidden to go. So, without directions of any sort, the Baudelaire children set off for the city's banking district in hopes of finding Mr. Poe. After walking through the meats district, the flower district, and the sculpture district, the three children arrived at the banking district, pausing to take a refreshing sip of water at the fountain of victorious finance. The banking district consisted of several wide streets with large marble buildings on each side of them, all banks. They went first to Trustworthy Bank, and then to Faithful Savings and Loan, and then to Subservient Financial Services, each time inquiring for Mr. Poe. Finally, a receptionist at Subservient said she knew that Mr. Poe worked down the street at Voltuary Money Management. The building was square and rather plain looking, though once inside, the three orphans were intimidated by the hustle and bustle of the people as they raced around the large, echoey room. Finally, they asked a uniformed guard whether they had arrived at the right place to speak to Mr. Poe, and he led them into a large office with many file cabinets and no windows. Why, hello, said Mr. Poe in a puzzled tone of voice. He was sitting at a desk covered in typed papers that looked important and boring. Surrounding a small framed photograph of his wife and his two beastly sons were three telephones with flashing lights. Please come in. Thank you, said Claus, shaking Mr. Poe's hand. The Baudelaire youngsters sat down in three large and comfortable chairs. Mr. Poe opened his mouth to speak, but had to cough into a handkerchief before he could begin. I'm very busy today, he said finally, so I don't have too much time to chat. Next time you should call ahead of time when you plan on being in the neighborhood, and I'll put some time aside to take you to lunch. That would be very pleasant, Violet said, and we're sorry we didn't contact you before we stopped by, but we find ourselves in an urgent situation. Count Olaf is a madman, Claus said, getting right to the point. We cannot stay with him. He struck Claus across the face. See his bruise? Violet said, but just as he said it, one of the telephones rang in a loud, unpleasant wail. Excuse me, Mr. Poe said and picked up the phone. Poe here, he said into the receiver. What? Yes. No, yes, thank you. He hung up the phone and looked at the Baudelaires as if he had forgotten they were there. I'm sorry, Mr. Poe said. What were we talking about? Oh, yes, Count Olaf. I'm sorry you don't have a good first impression of him. He has only provided us with one bed, Claus said. He makes us do a great many difficult chores. He drinks too much wine. Excuse me, Mr. Poe said, as another telephone rang. Poe here, he said. 7, 7, 7, 7, 6.5, 7. You're welcome. He hung up and quickly wrote something down on one of his papers, then looked at the children. I'm sorry, he said. What were you saying about Count Olaf? Making you do chores doesn't sound too bad. He calls us orphans. He has terrible friends. He is always asking about our money. Poco! This was from Sonny. Mr. Poe put up his hands to indicate he had heard enough. Children, he said, you must give yourselves time to adjust to your new home. You've only been there a few days. We have been there long enough to know Count Olaf is a bad man, Claus said. Mr. Poe sighed and looked at each of the three children. His face was kind, but it didn't look like he really believed what the Baudelaire orphans were saying. Are you familiar with the Latin term in loco parentis? He asked. Violet and Sunny looked at Claus, the biggest reader of the three. He was the most likely to know vocabulary words and foreign phrases. Something about trains? He asked. Maybe Mr. Poe was going to take them by train to another relative. Mr. Poe shook his head. In loco parentis means acting in the role of parent, he said. It is a legal term, and it applies to Count Olaf. Now that you are in his care, the Count may raise you using any methods he sees fit. I'm sorry if your parents did not make you do any household chores, or if you never saw them drink any wine, or if you like their friends better than Count Olaf's friends. But these are things that you must get used to, as Count Olaf is acting in loco parentis, understand? But he struck my brother, Violet said. Look at his face. As Violet spoke, Mr. Poe reached into his pocket for his handkerchief and, covering his mouth, coughed many, many times into it. He coughed so loudly that Violet could not be certain he had heard her. Whatever Count Olaf has done, Mr. Poe said, glancing down at one of the papers and circling a number. He has acted in loco parentis, and there's nothing I can do about it. Your money will be well protected by myself and by the bank. But Count Olaf's parenting techniques are his own business. Now I hate to usher you out post haste, but I have very much work to do. Sorry, memory. The three children just sat there, stunned. Mr. Poe looked up and cleared his throat. Post haste, he said, means you'll do nothing to help us. Violet finished for him, shaking. She was shaking with anger and frustration. As soon as one of the phones began ringing, she stood up and walked out of the room, followed by Claus, who was carrying Sonny. They walked out of the bank and stood on the street, not knowing what to do next. What shall we do next? Claus asked sadly. Violet stared up at the sky. She wished she could invent something that could take them out of there. It's getting a bit late, she said. We might as well go back and think of something else tomorrow. Perhaps we can stop and see Justice Strauss. But you said she wouldn't help us, Claus said. Not for help, Violet said. For books. It is very useful, when one is young, to learn the difference between literally and figuratively. If something happens literally, excuse me. If something happens literally, it actually happens. If something happens figuratively, it feels like it's happening. If you are literally jumping for joy, for instance, it means you are leaping in the air because you are very happy. If you are figuratively jumping for joy, it means you are so happy that you could jump for joy, but are saving your energy for other matters. The Baudelaire orphans walked back to Count Olaf's neighborhood and stopped at the home for Justice Strauss, who welcomed them inside and let them choose books from the library. Violet chose several about mechanical inventions. Claus chose several about wolves, and Sonny found a book with many pictures of teeth inside. They then went to their room and crowded together on the one bed, reading intently and happily. Figuratively, they escaped from Count Olaf and their miserable existence. They did not literally escape, because they were still in his house and vulnerable to Olaf's evil in loco parentis ways, but by immersing themselves in their favorite reading topics, they felt far away from their predicament, as if they had escaped. In the situation of the orphans, figuratively escaping was not enough, of course, but at the end of a tiring and hopeless day, it would have to do. Violet, Claus, and Sunny read their books, and, in the back of their minds, hoped that soon their figurative escape would eventually turn into a literal one. And that's the end of chapter 5 in a series of unfortunate events. The Bad Beginning. And right now, I'm looking at. So yeah, these chapters aren't too long, so we're going through this very quick, which is nice. I'm looking at how many pages we have left. Um, yeah. So okay. So we are less than 100 pages away from finishing this book. That's what I said. Less than 100 away from finishing this book. And we are right now about 35 minutes into this second part. So, okay. So we're at 35 minutes as of right now, and we are now on chapter 6. So, and there's 13 chapters, I believe. There should be 13 chapters. 13 meaning it's, bad luck. Yeah. Yeah, I don't see anything in here. So, yeah, we are on chapter 6. So, so sorry, Billy Crystal is wearing the hat that he wore in City Slickers. So, anywho, um, yeah, we'll go ahead and continue reading a series of unfortunate events and see how far we get from, and just see how much closer we'll get to finishing the book. Chapters Now is chapter 6 of a series of unfortunate events, the bad beginning. Yeah. The next morning, when the children stumbled sleepily from their bedroom into the kitchen, rather than a note from Count Olaf, they found Count Olaf himself. "Good morning, orphans," he said. "I have your oatmeal all ready in bowls for you." The children took seats in the kitchen table and stared nervously into their oatmeal. If you knew Count Olaf, and he suddenly served you a meal, wouldn't you be afraid there was something terrible in it, like poison or ground glass? But instead, Violet, Claus, and Sunny found that fresh raspberries had been sprinkled on top of each other of their portions. The Baudelaire orphans hadn't had raspberries since their parents died, although they were extremely fond of them. "Thank you, Claus said, carefully picking up one of the raspberries and examining it. Perhaps these were poison berries that just looked like delicious ones. Count Olaf, seeing how suspiciously Claus was looking at the berries, smiled and plucked a berry out of Sunny's bowl. Looking at each of the three youngsters, he popped it into his mouth and ate it. "Aren't raspberries delicious?" he asked. "They were my favorite berries when I was your age." Violet tried to picture Count Olaf as a youngster, but couldn't. His shiny eyes, bony hands, and shadowy smile all seemed to be things only adults possess. Despite her fear of him, however, she took her spoon in her right hand and began to eat her oatmeal. Count Olaf had eaten some, so it was probably so it probably wasn't poisonous. And anyway, she was very hungry. Claus began to eat too, as did Sunny, who got oatmeal and raspberries all over her face. "I received a phone call yesterday," Count Olaf said, "from Mr. Poe. He told me you children had been to see him." The children exchanged glances. They had hoped their visit would be taken in confidence, a phrase which here means kept a secret between Mr. Poe and themselves and not blabbed to Count Olaf. "Mr. Poe told me," Count Olaf said, "that you appeared to be having some difficulty adjusting to the life I have so graciously provided for you. I'm very sorry to hear that." The children looked at Count Olaf. His face was very serious, as if he were very sorry to hear that. But his eyes were shiny and bright, the way they were when someone is telling a joke. "Is that so?" Violet said. "I'm sorry, Mr. Poe. I'm sorry Mr. Poe bothered you." "I'm glad he did," Count Olaf said, "because I want the three of you to feel at home here, now that I am your father." The children shuddered a little at that, remembering their own kind father, and gazing sadly at the poor substitute now sitting across the table from them. Lately, Count Olaf said, I have been very nervous about my performances from the theater troupe, and I'm afraid I may have acted a bit standoffish. The word standoffish is a wonderful one, but it does not describe Count Olaf's behavior toward the children. It means reluctant to associate with others, and it might describe someone who, during a party, would stand in a corner and not talk to anyone. It would not describe somebody who provides one bed for three people to sleep in, forces them to do horrible chores, and strikes them across the face. There are many words for people like that, but standoffish is not one of them. Claus knew the word standoffish and almost laughed out loud at Olaf's incorrect use of it. But his face still had a bruise on it, so Claus remained silent. Therefore, to make you feel a little more at home here, I would like to have you participate in my next play. Perhaps, if you took part in the work I do, you would be less likely to run off complaining to Mr. Poe. In what way would we participate? Violet asked. She was thinking of all the chores they already did for Count Olaf, and was not in the mood to do more. Well, Count Olaf said, his eyes shining brightly, the play is called The Marvelous Marriage, and it is written by the great playwright Al Funcoat. Funcoot. We'll give only one performance on this Friday night. It is about a man who is very brave and intelligent, played by me. In the finale, he marries the young, beautiful woman he loves, in front of a crowd cheering people. You, Claus, and you, Sonny, will play some of the cheering people in the crowd. But we're shorter than most adults, Claus said. Won't that look strange to the audience? You'll be playing two midgets who attend the wedding, Olaf said patiently. And what will I do? Violet asked. I am very handy with tools, so perhaps I could help you build the set. Build the set? Heavens no, Count Olaf said. A pretty girl like you shouldn't be working backstage. But I'd like to, Violet said. Count Olaf's one eyebrow raised slightly, and the Baudelaire orphans recognized this sign of his anger. But then the eyebrow went down again, as he forced himself to remain calm. But but I have such an important role for you on stage, he said. You are going to play the young woman I marry. Violet felt her oatmeal and raspberries shift around in her stomach, as if she had just caught the flu. It was bad enough having Count Olaf acting in loco parentis and announcing himself as their father. But to consider this man her husband, even for the purpose of a play, was even more dreadful. It's a very important role, he continued, his mouth curling up into an unconvincing smile. Although you have no lines other than I do, which you will say when Justice Strauss asks you if you will have me. Justice Strauss? Violet said. What does she have to do with it? She has agreed to play the part of the judge, Count Olaf said. Behind him, one of the eyes painted on the kitchen walls closely watched over each of the Baudelaire children. I asked Justice Strauss to participate because I wanted to be neighborly, as well as fatherly. Count Olaf, Violet said, and then stopped herself. She wanted to argue her way out of playing his bride, but she didn't want to make him angry. Father, she said, I'm not sure I'm talented enough to perform professionally. I would hate to disgrace your good name and the name of Al Funcoot. Plus, I'll be very busy in the next few weeks working on my inventions and learning how to prepare roast beef, she added quickly, remembering how he had behaved about dinner. Count Olaf reached out of his spidery hands and stroked Violet on the chin, looking deep into his eyes. You will, he said, participate in this theatrical performance. I would prefer it if you would participate voluntarily. But as I believe Mr. Poe explained to you, I can order you to participate, and you must obey. Olaf's sharp and dirty fingernails gently scratched on Violet's chin, and she shivered. The room was very, very quiet as Olaf finally let go and stood up and left without a word. The Baudelaire children listened to his heavy footsteps go up the stairs to the tower they were forbidden to enter. Well, Klaus said hesitantly, I guess it won't hurt to be in the play. It seems to be very important to him, and we want to keep on his good side. But he must be up to something, Violet said. Violet said. You don't think those berries were poisoned, do you? Klaus asked worriedly. No, Violet said. Olaf is after the fortune we will inherit. Killing us would do him no good. But what good does it do him to have us be in his stupid play? I don't know, Violet admitted miserably. She stood up and started washing out the oatmeal bowls. I wish we knew something more about inheritance laws. Inheritance law, Claus said. I'll bet Count Olaf has cooked up some plan to get our money, but I don't know what it could be. I guess we could ask Mr. Poe about it, Violet said doubtfully, as Claus stood beside her and dried the dishes. He knows all those Latin legal phrases. But Mr. Poe would probably call Count Olaf again, and then he'd know we were onto him, Claus pointed out. Maybe we should try to talk to Justice Strauss. She's a judge, so she must know all about the law. But she's also Olaf's neighbor, Violet replied, and she might tell him what we had asked. Claus took his glasses off, which he often did when he was thinking hard. How could we find out about the law without Olaf's knowledge? Book! Sunny shouted suddenly. She probably meant something like, would somebody please wipe my face? But it made Violet and Claus look at each other. Book! They were both thinking of the same thing. Surely Justice Strauss would have a book on inheritance. Count Olaf didn't leave us any chores to do, Violet said. So I suppose we are free to visit Justice Strauss in her library. Claus smiled. Yes, indeed, he said. And you know, today I don't think I'll choose a book on wolves. Nor I, Violet said, on mechanical engineering. I think I'd like to read about inheritance law. Well, let's go, Claus said. Justice Strauss said we could come over soon, and we don't want to be standoffish. At the mention of the word that Count Olaf had used so ridiculously, the Baudelaire orphans all laughed, even Sunny, who of course did not have a very big vocabulary. Swiftly, they put away the clean oatmeal bowls in the kitchen cupboards, which watched them with painted eyes. Then the three young then the three young people ran next door. Friday, the day of the performance, was only a few days off, and the children wanted to figure out Count Olaf's plan as quickly as possible. And that is the end of chapter 6 in a series of unfortunate events, The Bad Beginning. We are now at 48, almost 49 minutes in this. So, let me just see if we have. Let's see here. Let's see here. This is 83. Okay, it's about 10 pages there. Uh. So 4, 5, 6. We read 3 chapters, which has been our normal so far. We'll go ahead and call it a. Yeah, we'll go ahead and call this a night for right now. So we've been moving through this really quick, which is nice. I think at this point we are 62, 162. Yeah, we just passed the halfway point in this book already. And this is only part 2 of our series of unfortunate events. Like I said, this is part 2. I'm very, very curious to see how much closer we'll finish on the next week's part. So I hope you all have been excited about this book and going through this book again and again. I know this has been a popular series for all of you, and I hope you guys are enjoying this book as much as I am. So I hope we get to uh, we'll get to read more of this book next week. So sorry, my eyes are hurting a bit. Anywho, I hope you all enjoyed the reading of this book, and I hope you all have a fantastic evening. Until next time, I'm the Epileptic Explorer, and I hope you all have a fantastic evening.